This is your therapy session, Christine Cupo. Juventus, we talked about them in All or Nothing. Okay, take a breather. All right. Okay, first of all, how are you coping right now?
Well, it hasn't been particularly enjoyable. I have consistently said that was it pretty? No. Was it a fun time? Not particularly. But did we win? Hopefully, right? So, yeah, we've had.
What's the main source of frustration to you? Like, you're looking at this Juventus side, somebody that just dominates Serie A, not just like wins every now, dominates. What's the main source of frustration?
Well, I think that part of it is we need to let go of that notion because we're no longer that team.
Right.
And I think that supporter expectations will never possibly meet the reality of things, but we are now roughly, I think, probably 5 seasons beyond when we should have looked at a rebuilding year, essentially, but we'll never call it that. So we are now back at what is essentially square one with Allegri. I think that despite the fact that he has acknowledged that the game has changed, which I think that nobody is going to disagree with that. That's the reality of it, right? We notice even the reality of the current Serie A table reflects the fact that the game has changed, right? And so for someone seasoned like Allegri, thank you for the 5 Scudetto wins and the 2 Coppa Italias and, bringing us into Champions League. But I think that we're having the same old problem, reliance on some players that harken back to his first go, like Sandro, for example, who just hasn't really performed, that he was always heavily relying on, that he insists on continuing with, playing Rabiot out of position, playing Locatelli occasionally out of position. There's a lot of things that are happening that sort of go along with some of the criticisms from last season where people were shouting into the void, Pirlo isn't trying or changing anything up. And now we are trying and changing things up, despite the fact that most of the time that looks like 4-4-2 that devolves into like a 3-4-1-1 while we're playing or something to that effect. There's a lot of things that are just, it was more illuminating to see the all or nothing from last season and see how the players interact on a personal level and just to see what the vibe is, because there's definitely a disconnect between their camaraderie that's evident on the tape and what's actually playing out on field.
Yeah.
So I think I have a few qualms about Allegri's approach. And because I'm an absolute sicko, I went back and read Allegri's thesis recently.
Of course
from
you did.
2004. Yeah. And he's like referring to Spal. And I'm like, okay. But the crazy part is like the first paragraph, he's like, I want to try 4-4-2. And I'm like, what? This is how many years later and we're still in the same place. And it just goes to show that despite him acknowledging that he needs to be nimble, he may actually be incapable.
To that point, though, if you think about Alexi's thesis was about the characteristics, tactical, physical, mental of 3 central midfielders in a system that uses 3 central midfielders, right?
And with the caveat being that he has players suited to those things. And so now we're seeing exactly, it's so weird to see in hindsight that this man is still working off of his own blueprint, which I guess makes sense, right? Because it's your comfort zone. It's what you know. It's what you've actually utilized in the past that has brought you success. But to your other point, just because you're doing the same things and they worked in the past doesn't mean they're going to work season over season.
Right. And it is wild, as you were saying, to hear him talk about what worked for us at Livorno, what worked for us at Spal. It's like, all right, this guy would go on to win 5 Scudetti, 1 with Milan, 4 with Juve. But what's interesting about what you said is that the game has changed, and it's changed in ways that Allegri seemed to want them to change, right? Not that he was necessarily implementing, but he would lament the fact that he would say, and he said in a derogatory way, I think it's a positive for Serie A, is that you can like show up at the start of the game, write down the tactical formations of both teams, take a 1-hour nap, wake up, and everybody was standing in the same position. So he wanted that change. He wanted teams to be more fluid, for pieces to be more interchangeable. And if you look at the rest of the Serie A, it is more fluid, more interchangeable, whereas Juve are still slightly more rigid.
Extremely.
So be careful what you wish for in a way. Like the rest of Serie A.
Extremely. And I keep saying, like, I'm waiting for the day. I favored, in a lot of ways, Pirlo's thesis because I also lean more toward maybe a Gasparini style where bless us with something even remotely resembling that, because I just miss I miss having that excitement, like there's only so much that like you get up one and then just like sit and hang out and hope to God that your defense is as solid as they've always been.
Yeah, one of the major issues and themes, not just in Serie A, not just with Juventus, I actually connected as well to Manchester United for a little bit, is that sometimes these clubs that are so used to, keeping this level of hierarchy, almost omnipotence, is that they're too in love with their own history. And so it's very difficult to adapt to modernity. So that's a main issue. The Gasperini system, this whole of Mike Tyson sort of everybody has a plan until you punch them in the face, takes not necessarily decades, but it does take a certain philosophy that has to permeate throughout an entire club. So
or like a particularly special player that can make it work, right? So like when Gasperini was doing like a 3-4-1-2, it's because he had Papu to rely on, which how many other like tactics can you actually deploy when you have a special player that you can use like that?
And just one more note on Pirlo. The problem with Pirlo that I saw in the all or nothing thing is that, Pirlo in many ways was, Dre was talking about, reactive philosophy sometimes or whatever. Pirlo was a reactive manager. He was reacting to what was happening in training, reacting to what was going on at halftime, whatever. There was never this kind of like, I'm putting my foot down. And a lot of it has to come with the fact that in nature, that's what he was like as a player. He like not necessarily reactive, but very passive. He let his feet do the talking. You kind of needed somebody to just go in there and be like, not in an Allegri sense, but to your point, Christine, about being a Gasperini side going, we need to adapt and we need to be proactive, not reactive. Final point on a Juventus Dre Cordero. What say you?
My final point is that I love a podcast that gets into like managerial theses. Like, what are we got really into the weeds there on this?
You know what? I want a podcast with Christine is like, it's 3 a.m. and she's like drunk, just reading like different theses. I think that would
honestly be that and like Super Valenza, where I'm like, who wants to talk accounting? Like,
let's talk capital gains in Italian football.
I love it.
Like, who wants to hear about the accrual method accounting and how we're not doing the matching system correctly?
I think you were pretty close to being back though, right? So like they've only lost twice in the last 10 all competitions, 5-2 loss. They're winning, and they're winning in the old school Juve way, which is they score first and then frustrate the hell out of you, and they don't let you play. So I think we're seeing, as you said, yes, it takes time to implement a proactive system. It takes time to implement almost any system, and coaches will tell you they'll need at least minimum 40 training sessions to get their points across, and that's just to get things started. So I think we are seeing a much better Juve, or at least the Juve that Allegri wants. But the problem is they don't have the kind of lead that they were accustomed to having at this stage of the season when they were winning all those Scudetti.